This third lesson in the series on syntax looks at examples of sentence structures that differ from the default or canonical sentence structures analysed in Syntax Lesson 2. We will examine the reasons why writers may choose to construct sentences that deviate from the default, and we will look at the various ways they have of doing so. Before continuing, it's useful to review the 5 primary constituents of a sentence, since these terms will be used throughout this lesson. The 5 constituents are the subject, verb, also called predicator, complement, object, and adjunct, also called adverbial. The definitions of these terms here are, with one exception, from the Oxford Dictionary of English Grammar. You can find more detailed explanations and examples in the glossary section of the lesson index page. Since grammatical explanations are best accompanied by examples, here are each of the 5 primary constituents in exemplifying sentences. Okay, in order to analyse exceptions to the default order of constituents, it's important to remind ourselves of what those default orders are. This was the topic of the previous lesson. Here are the 7 canonical declarative sentence orders as listed by grammarians. You will note that each of the 7 structures starts with subject-verb, SV. These structures reflect the fundamental assumptions that readers have of how information will be presented to them, sentence by sentence. The first assumption is that the sentence will start with who or what the sentence is about. Most often, the who or what the sentence is about will be the grammatical subject, as in the examples on this slide. The second assumption is that the grammatical subject will be followed by a verb phrase indicating what the subject is, or does, or experiences. In the example sentences, the subject is italicized and the verb phrase is in bold. If the verb is a transitive verb, then the third assumption is that the next constituent will be an object. So, for example, the natural expectation after she ate is that we will be told what she ate. This is why she ate a pizza for dinner sounds much more natural than she ate for dinner a pizza. These 3 reader assumptions or expectations are the basis for the classification of English as an SVO language. Quiz page. Pause the video if you want to review the questions and answers before continuing. So, we have looked at the basic expectations that readers have in respect of the various specific constituent orders of sentences. But readers also have more general expectations about how information will be presented to them. The 4 most important expectations for the structure of sentences are encapsulated in the principles of topic comment, given new, end focus, and end weight, as briefly explained here. The first general expectation is that the topic of the sentence will come before the comment about the topic. So in the simple sentence, Mary passed her driving test yesterday, the topic is Mary, and the comment about Mary is that she passed her driving test yesterday. Here are more sentences exemplifying the topic comment principle. You will note that in each case the topic is the grammatical subject. In many cases, however, writers do not want the grammatical subject to be the topic of the sentence. They want it to be about some other information. A simple example is, after the storm, a rainbow appeared in the sky. The topic of the sentence is after the storm, and the comment is that a rainbow appeared in the sky. The slide has more examples of an element other than the grammatical subject as the topic. The second general expectation is that given information will precede new information. The concept of given information is somewhat vague, but it can be basically understood as information that the writer and the reader share. For example, because the information has already been mentioned in the discourse, or because it is information that the reader can be expected to know already, or to be able to infer. Often the given information is represented by a pronoun. For example, the pronoun she in the second sentence of the text, "My sister's name is Mary, she lives in Paris." Compare this with the equivalent text in which the second sentence starts with new information, Paris. "My sister's name is Mary, Paris is where she lives." Native speakers would probably find this alternative text less natural without necessarily knowing why. Given information also includes information that the reader can be expected to know already or to infer. For example, the author can be designated given information in the second sentence of the text. "I'm reading an interesting book. The author is a Soviet dissident." The reader already knows that books have authors and can assume that the author in this case is the author of the book I'm reading. The new information is the comment about the author. The third general expectation is that information at the end of the sentence will be the relatively most important information. This end focus principle is linked to the given new principle, since it is clear that the new information in a sentence will usually be the most important information. It will be the information that the writer wishes the reader to focus on. The second sentence in the highlighted text above is an example of the relationship between given new and end focus. Another example of the combination of given new and end focus is the second sentence in "I walked into the shed this morning. Behind the lawnmower was a baby raccoon." The most important information is at the end of the sentence concerning the presence of the raccoon. The lawnmower can be considered given information, since the reader can be expected to know that sheds often contain lawnmowers. Compare the original text with the equivalent version. "I walked into the shed this morning. A baby raccoon was behind the lawnmower." In this case, the baby raccoon is in the given position in the second sentence, and behind the lawnmower has end focus. Many readers are likely to find this alternative version less natural and wonder why the lawnmower seems to be more important to the writer than the presence of the baby raccoon. The fourth general expectation is that the end of the sentence will be the relatively weightiest element of the sentence in terms of length and/or complexity. There are two probable reasons for this expectation. Firstly, the weightiest element is more likely to be new information. Thus, the principle of end weight is related to the principle of given new. Secondly, a weighty element elsewhere in the sentence, especially when it is the subject, places a greater cognitive load on the reader. A comparison of two sentences of equal meaning from the Cambridge Grammar of the English Language, CGEL, should make the principle of end weight clear. Sentence 1. Sue picked up a couple of boxes containing old computer manuals. Sentence 2. Sue picked a couple of boxes containing old computer manuals up. The CGEL talks about the strong preference for the first version, which ends with a lengthy and complex noun phrase. Consider a further example. The first sentence above has a very weighty subject and ends with a very light complement. This requires the reader to keep a large amount of information in her head before coming to the very short comment on the subject. The second sentence, with equivalent information, conforms to the principle of end weight and will probably be found easier to process. In summary of what we've seen so far, there are 7 default or canonical constituent orders, but writers may choose to diverge from these default structures in order to achieve a particular effect, or to ensure compliance with one of the 4 general principles or reader expectations. The term for this divergence from the default orders is information packaging. On the slide is the Cambridge Grammar of the English Languages explanation of the term. There are several specific information packaging techniques for altering the default constituent order of the sentence. The most important ones are listed here. We will see how the specific techniques allow the writer to conform to one or other of the general reader expectations or structural principles we analysed in the previous section of the lesson. We'll start with the most common information packaging technique, namely fronting. The primary purpose of fronting is to set the topic of the sentence. In most cases, the topic of the sentence will be the grammatical subject. For example, Mary passed her driving test yesterday. So in each of the 7 canonical structures, the subject is the fronted element, and the rest of the sentence in each case is the comment. But direct and indirect objects and complements can also be fronted, as in the examples on this slide. In the sentence, "My new phone I bought on Amazon," the writer wishes the topic to be the new phone and the comment about it to be where it was bought. Fronted objects are often found in what can loosely be called comparative sentences, such as "Cats I like, but dogs I adore," and "My mother I gave a book, my sister I gave a bracelet." The most common type of fronted element, however, is the adjunct. Writers usually front adjuncts not so much in order to make them the topic, but to give them more emphasis or focus than they would have in their more common position at the end of the sentence. A related reason is that writers may wish a different constituent to have end focus. Here are several examples of fronted adjuncts. So far, in all the examples of fronting, the presence of the fronted element does not change the subject-verb order of the rest of the sentence. But there are certain fronted elements that do indeed necessitate a reverse in the default SV order. An example is, "So excited was Mary that she couldn't sleep." The grammatical term for this reversal of subject and verb is inversion. The slide has more examples of the necessary subject-verb inversion following comparative adjectives and adverbs. The second type of fronted element that requires inversion of subject and verb is the negative or restrictive adjuncts. One negative adjunct is never, in "Never has he apologised for his bad behaviour." And a restrictive adjunct is scarcely, in "Scarcely had she finished her meal than she left without saying a word." Fronting these words gives them extra focus or emphasis. The slide has more example sentences and a selective list of common adjuncts requiring inversion. The third type of expression that necessitates the inversion of subject and verb is a few locative and temporal expressions. For example, here in "Here comes the bus," "Here's Johnny," and "Now" in "Now is the time to do something about it." Note, however, that the normal subject-verb order is used following such expressions when the subject is a pronoun, not a noun. So, for example, it must be, here she comes, not here comes she. The fourth example of necessary subject-verb inversion is when the fronted element is a prepositional phrase, usually one of location, that acts as the complement of the verb. Here are several such sentences. The examples here apply the principles of end focus and end weight. The fifth and final example of subject-verb inversion after fronting is that which occurs when the sentence is fronted by a participle complement of the verb, most often the verb to be. There are several examples on the slide. This construction is chosen in most cases by writers wishing to apply the principles of end focus and end weight. While on the topic of inversion, it's worth finishing with a particular type of inversion that does not follow a fronted element, namely conditional clauses that omit the conjunction if. Such clauses start with had, were, or should. Note that this construction is more formal than its equivalent version, starting with if, and that the clauses can be reversed in each case. For example, I would be the first to volunteer should the opportunity arise. Quiz page. Pause the video if you want to review the questions and answers before continuing. So, we will now review the other specific information packaging techniques and see how each complies with one of the 4 general reader expectations. We'll start with the passive. For review, here is a list of passive sentences with the verb phrase highlighted. You will note that each verb phrase uses the be auxiliary in one of its forms and is followed by the past participle of the lexical verb. A sentence in the passive starts with the grammatical subject, but that subject is in fact the object of the equivalent canonical sentence. A simple example is the canonical John ate the pizza. The pizza is the object, which becomes the subject of the passive version. The pizza was eaten by John. One reason to use the passive version is to make the object, the pizza in this case, the topic of the sentence. This could be in a context where the different food eaten by various people is listed. A second important reason to choose the passive is to comply with the given new principle. For example, in the first Poland text here, the second and third sentences start with new information. In the second text, they start with given information, enabled by the use of the passive. Most readers will likely find the second text less awkward and more cohesive, without necessarily being able to say why. The final reason that writers may prefer the passive is that such constructions allow them to meet the other 2 general reader expectations. Compare the end focus and the relative weight of the final element in the 2 sentences here. It was caused by the invasion of Poland by German troops reads and sounds better than the invasion of Poland by German troops caused it. The next information packaging technique, postposing, is the opposite of fronting. It takes an element out of its usual position and places it at the end of the sentence. Typically, the postposed constituent is the object or the complement. Consider, for example, the canonical SVOA sentence, "She placed the quarterly report on my desk." Postposing the object, the quarterly report, results in the non-canonical SVAO structure, "She placed on my desk the quarterly report." The slide has more examples. Writers remove constituents from their canonical position and place them at the end of the sentence in order to comply with the principles of end focus and or end weight. The postposed versions of the sentences here have a much weightier conclusion than their canonical equivalents, and they place the focus on the element in the sentence that the writer considers the most important. Postposed structures can be easier to process or disambiguate. Extrapositioning is the next information packaging technique. Extrapositions most often start with "it is" or "it was." For example, "It was disappointing you couldn't come to the party," and "it is no use crying over spilt milk." But they are also present in more complex constructions, such as "he found it frustrating that no one would listen to him." There are further examples of extraposition constructions on the slide. The primary reason why writers choose extraposition is to comply with the principle of end weight. Compare the weight of the adjective phrase at the end of the exposition sentences here with the weight of the adjective in the alternative version with the same meaning. An associated reason is that the length of the subject in the SVC version can make the sentence more difficult to process. It is not surprising, therefore, that extrapositions are far more common than their alternative equivalents. The next information packaging technique is what grammarians call the existential there. Most commonly, there is followed by the verb to be in one of its forms. For example, "there's a fly in my soup," and "there will be consequences." But there are a few other verbs that can be used in this construction. Seems in "there seems to be a problem" is one such example. Writers choose the existential there or prefer it to the non-existential equivalent, if there is one, since it complies with the given new, end weight and end focus principles. Compare the two versions of a sentence from the previous slide. In the existential version, the words in bold are the semantic subject. This is new information. It has much more weight than its non-existential equivalent, and it attains the reader's focus. The next information packaging technique is the use of a cleft sentence. Clefts are basically a way to reorder a sentence by removing a constituent from its conventional position and turning it into a clause. The clause is then placed at the front or at the end of the sentence. There are three types of cleft sentence: it clefts, pseudo-clefts, also known as WH clefts, and reverse pseudo-clefts. Each of these three cleft types is associated with one or more of the general organizational principles. The it cleft explicitly sets the topic of the sentence and gives it focus. It reverses the given new expectation. The pseudo-cleft sentence conforms to the given new principle and places the focus on the element at the end. The reverse pseudo-cleft has the WH clause at the end of the sentence and usually conforms to the principle of end weight. We've seen how fronting can make a constituent other than the grammatical subject the topic of the sentence. The information packaging technique of topicalization does the same, but in a more explicit way, typically through the use of a prepositional phrase. There are example sentences on the slide, together with a list of several more topicalization phrases that can start a sentence. Clearly, the primary aim of topicalization is to leave the reader in no doubt as to the main issue of concern or importance in the sentence. Topicalization is the explicit adherence to the information packaging principle of topic comment. Here are the sentences from the previous slide, plus more examples. The topic is highlighted in each case. The final information packaging technique we will look at is dislocation. The technique of dislocation splits an unmarked sentence into a noun phrase and a finite clause connected in writing by a comma and by a pause in speaking. In left dislocation, the semantic subject or topic remains at the start of the sentence and the comment phrase follows it. The reverse is true in right dislocation. The topic is shown in bold in each case here. In left dislocation, the first clause is a clear case of explicit topicalization. For example, the topicalization of "that book I lent you" in "that book I lent you, can I have it back?" Furthermore, the first clause is an example of compliance with the given new principle. The prior loaning of the book is given information or shared knowledge between writer and reader. The same content in right dislocation is "can I have it back, that book I lent you?" In this case, the second clause is needed in order to clarify the pronoun it in the first clause. Right dislocation overrides the given new principle but complies with end focus. It's important to note that writers may sometimes need to choose between two of the general organizational principles that stand in conflict with each other. For example, in the second sentence of the first text here, the writer has chosen to conform to the given new principle. And in the second sentence of the second text, with exactly the same message, the writer has chosen to conform to the end weight principle. Here is an example of a choice between end focus and end weight. In choosing which principle to apply in any given sentence, writers need to take account of the wider context in which the sentence is situated. In other words, information packaging decisions at the sentence level are influenced by general considerations of how to present the reader with an easily comprehensible, cohesive and stylistically pleasing text. Let's summarize this introduction to information packaging by reviewing some of the different ways that the same fact about a meal can be packaged and presented to the reader. Each one of these is grammatical and conceivable in a particular context. In conclusion, we have seen that writers often make deliberate changes to the default constituent order in sentences, and that they have various reasons for doing so. English learners should be aware of these changes and the motivations underlying them. This presupposes that learners know about the general organizational principles and the specific information packaging techniques in English to achieve them. Not only will this knowledge help learners to become more effective in writing texts in the various genres, but it will also make them more competent readers of the texts that others have written. In this way, they can accurately understand not only the writer's words, but also the implications behind the writer's decisions to structure the sentence in a certain way. Finally, you may be interested to learn before we sum up that of the 174 declarative sentences in this lesson, approximately 75% started with the canonical subject-verb order. The other 25% were the result of the application of one of the information packaging techniques, in most cases the fronting of an adjunct. Of the rest of the 25%, most sentences were extrapositions or existential theirs. Just 2 sentences had an inversion of subject and verb. Quiz page. Pause the video if you want to review the questions and answers before continuing. Okay, you've now come to the end of this third and final lesson on English syntax. We have looked at information packaging techniques and the resulting exceptions to the canonical word order of declarative sentences. Here is a summary of the important information about this grammatical topic. In the description below this video, you will find a link to the lesson index page shown on the left. As you can see, there are 4 ways to access the content, as well as a glossary and links to quizzes and more information on the topic.